other folks who aren't here can learn how to use this guide. Okay, so this is a bit of a how-to presentation. And then we're going to ask for any other inspiration you have after you know a bit more about the guide, about how you think you could use it to support your organization, because it's totally going to go beyond what we think it can be used for. I know that it's going to be crucial and useful for so many different reasons. On that note, what's in the guide? So I want to just let you know what's in the guide, and you can follow along. Of course, we have an introduction where we talk about the purpose, which is more than a technical exercise. Ramisha beautifully shared vulnerably what the why really is about this. What is the why? We know. Then what we go into is some key considerations for survivor support based on good international practices. We have a whole section on how you, focal points, and other folks in your organization can develop your own in-country survivor guide, and then suggested recommended sections of what you must put in a guide that you develop in country. And then there's a section on how to bring this guide to life, because it's all great to have this guide and say, oh, I made this guide, but what's really important is to operationalize it, make it a living document that folks can use and make it readily available. So we give you tips on that. And then, of course, you'll see there's a lot of resources included throughout the guide. And at the end, there are some definitions. And then there's an annex at the end, which actually has a short template so that you can start with a template to create your own guide from this template. So we've given you a lot of tools to start you off so you're not starting from scratch. Okay. So I just want to go through some key sections here. So the introduction, as I said, it's the why of the guide, right? So we developed this knowing that, as Noelia had mentioned, survivors are going to go to anyone in the organization potentially. So we wanted to develop a tool so that everyone has a grasp on what to do when someone comes forward. And the goal is really to support organizations, as Ramisha had mentioned, to prepare before something happens, right? We know that it can't be, as Ramisha said, we're thinking, look, this is still happening. We want to eradicate it. In the meantime, we need people to be proactively prepared, not reactive after an incident, so that we can do less harm to people in the future. So we want this guide to close the gap on implementing support policies and procedures. Sometimes we think we know what to do, but on the ground, when something happens, be prepared beforehand to be that support and have people have resources and know what's available, not for survivor, so they can make informed choices. Okay, so that's the introduction. Anything you want to add, Ramisha, before I move on to the other sections?
No, you're doing great.
Thanks, Ramisha. Okay, so key consideration. So we wanted to start you off after the intro and the guide on what is survivor support. A lot of us work in this space. We wanted to give you like a baseline understanding, right? So what we've done is talk about what survivor support looks like based on good international practices. We know, as many of you know, that this is evolving in the PSCA context. And a lot of this is inspired from many of you folks on the line who may be working in the GBV case management space as well already. So we outline some key elements of what survivor support needs to look like in the PSCA space. And we know, very importantly, that in this space, your organization has a duty of care to ensure that those who are harmed by SCA have access to basic survivor support services. That's a really important thing to remember in PSCA. But we outline some of the basic survivor services that need to be there. Things that you might think of include medical care, material care, food, clothing, psychosocial support, law enforcement services that are available. Those are more of the immediate needs. We also name the very real potential for long-term support that's needed resulting from SCA, both psychosocial impacts on the survivor and also some physical impacts. For example, some organizations have supported survivors who need to drop out of school due to an incident of SCA, or if there's a woman who actually bears a child because of SCA. Organizations provide support, often for parent to child. I'm giving you some ideas based on some of the good practices of organizations already in their policies. So we highlight that basic support needs to be provided regardless, I often stress this, regardless of whether a report is reviewed, investigated, or corroborated. And that's often where there's a pause for a lot of organizations and where they make some missteps here because they're, oh, what do we do? But support needs to happen regardless, okay? And also we name that it's important to remember that others, like a whistleblower or witnesses, or bystanders, may also need support or protection from the organization. So we name a few of those important things that often organizations may in the moment forget about. And you'll see that there is an overview of the basic survivor-centered approach in the introduction, in the section. We also link it with a trauma-informed approach, which many of you know is crucial throughout a reporting and investigations process when we're talking about PSEA, okay? And then we name the importance of an intersectional and intercultural lens, which is so important because we created this guide because, as Ramisha had shared, often people are working in different country contexts and there's different understandings. As you pointed out, there's different attitudes. So it's really important that that lens be throughout all of your work. So we name, there's a lot of different things you have to think about. This month is Pride Month, so I'll name that when we think about LGBTQI+ survivors, they may face additional sources of stigma, barriers in coming forward, even criminalization in those contexts. So these are things to keep in mind where you're working. If you're having an incident that involves someone under the age of 18, some child protection resources we've included in this section that you need to think about. Visible and invisible disabilities play a key role, and the ability to access certain resources in country contexts. And really important for a lot of you folks in the line who are working, say, with IDPs or immigrants or newcomers, the legal status is really important to know and think about. Because citizenship status can change what resources and support are available for survivors. So I wanted to name that those are some really important things to think about. There's other factors we list in this section. Anything to add?
No, I think that was great. I just think a lot of organizations have survivor-centered approaches, but it's also really important to remember that the care that you're providing or the supports you're providing really do have to be trauma-informed, because if the resources that you're providing are not, they can re-traumatize the person who has been willing to come forward and look for resources. So it's really important to make sure that the trauma-informed principles are being addressed in the services that you're looking at.
Thanks, Ramisha, for that. I think it's really important to add that this is a new topic for a lot of folks, but I would just say it's to normalize this topic. People get afraid to talk about trauma. Let's normalize that this is something that happens and just have everybody understand what this means so that you can react even more supportively. So thanks for that. So then we give you some tips on how you can develop your own in-country survivor support guide, right, as part of your programming. And so we give you some tips about before you develop the guide, and then when you've developed the guide, some tips there, right? So some things that we note that are important to include, and I know this also from working with organizations, appointing at least one PSA focal point is something that not all organizations have done, right? And not only not having one, but sometimes when you do have one, they don't necessarily have adequate time and resources. So we keep stressing that throughout the guide to make sure they've got resources and capacity building in this person, they've got their own support when you set that up in the organization. Other things that we recommend are reaching out to women's rights and advocacy organizations, working with them to create the guide and compensate them for their work. Doing a context, vulnerability, and SEA risk assessment, many of you have, but just to make sure that that's top of mind. Mapping of available support services, which seems obvious, but often we don't do that until after the fact, right? So mapping what's available. And once your guide is developed, it's so important that all stakeholders, program participants, all of your staff, every new person who comes in has very easy access to this guide and resources so that the survivor can make decisions, but they don't even have to disclose. They've got information they need to know what to do. And people just don't have to look around or rifle through pages. They've got something. So that's what's really important. So that's some crucial tips that we give. And Ramisha, before I jump in, anything else to add that I missed about the tips there?
No, just on one of those pieces. So if you develop the guide, you should also take a look at the policies that you have in place. So for example, I know that there's a couple of organizations whose policy is that if something happens, the person in country is immediately flown home and it's not sort of a conversation. So that piece of the policy is also not very survivor centered, where the survivor should be able to make that decision for themselves if that's the right next step for them. So these guides are sort of, again, one piece of the puzzle. So policies also need to follow.
Nice, totally. We talk a little bit about policies in the next section, but it's good to think about the content of those policies, right? Because I think that's another reason that we can use this guide. I'm actually thinking about another way you can use this guide is to review good practices and things you can improve in your own policies. So some of the suggested sections that we think you need to have in a guide that you're creating in country to support survivors include obviously what available supports there are. You're going to be mapping it out and highlighting the local context, the barriers to support. And so survivors also know what the costs are of support. Maybe there's barriers in terms of people only speaking the local language, as Ramisha had mentioned. So these are all things to think about when you're mapping out the local support that's available. Organizational policies, as Ramisha had mentioned, are important to include in your guide and also review potentially, as Ramisha had mentioned. And I want to name a couple organizations, one of which is on the line. Crossroads International, Oxfam Great Britain actually have created survivor support policy that clearly lay out what support is available from the organization, and they're widely publicized, and they talk about including, what is available through an insurance program, an employee assistance program, and these are widely disseminated. And this is a newer practice for organizations, but it really sends the message that survivor support, different from your other policies, is a priority in the organization. And it's very transparent about what the organization is committed to doing. So other sections that you should be including in a guide would include, of course, a safety and protection section. So you've done a risk assessment. You want to make sure that there's an immediate safety plan and protection plan in place to make sure that the risk of retaliation is mitigated, risks to possible breaches of confidentiality, etc. And then you also, of course, want to make sure that medical services and social services that are available are clearly laid out. Again, knowing that the survivor knows what they can expect when they receive medical attention, what medications are available or not available in the country, things that you can think of as an organization to make medications available, like Plan B. I know some organizations actually have them in their vehicles or have traveling emissions for staff. They bring medication with them, prophylactic medication. And then there's also a really important note, the section that you should be including about the local, legal, and cultural context. Because we know that sexual violence is going to be defined differently, understood differently, reacted to differently in different contexts, it's important to have done some research about the legal system and the definitions of key terms for your guide and include them for each country of operation. So key terms, we put them in the guide for you, include sexual assault. You want to know how that is defined, intimate partner violence, age of consent, laws on abortion, really important, and sex work laws in the country. And there's a whole section that we talk about that and being mindful of how you approach folks who may be involved in sex work, and they can be PSA survivors. So just important to think of all of that. And also, we talk about the fact that services may be unavailable, right? We know that often happens, but organizations still have a duty of care to ensure there is some access and to facilitate access to basic survivor support. So we give you some tips based on good international practices of what you can do as an organization in the event that there's scarce resources where you're working. Okay, Misha, take it from here. Anything else to add before I move on?
No, that covers most of it, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is the, I have a hard time saying this word even in English, operationalizing your guide section. So we thought it was really important. I thought it was so important too, because often, like many organizations, they create a guide as part of a deliverable and it sits on a shelf. This is not what this guide needs to do. So we wanted to include a whole section on how you make this a living document that will be implemented, communicated to your staff and program participants, living, working, accessible document. So we listed some recommendations, and you're probably going to have others, right, that are on the line of how you can operationalize this. But some key ones include, of course, you got to know what the reporting requirements are and your requirements regarding PSCA are, Global Affairs Canada requirements in Canada, for example. We have a section where we talk about training So suggesting that you integrate regular training of this guide you create and survivor support into your regular staff training on sexual violence, or PSEA, in staff orientation. Make it part and parcel of the work that you do. Making sure that the guides that you create and survivor support resources are updated regularly, because resources change, numbers change, organizations close. So you want to make sure that it's updated regularly. Budget and planning, I put this in, having worked for a fair number of NGOs myself. It's important to integrate the creation of this guide and survivor support into your annual planning and project budgets. Because as I mentioned, focal points and others who work on this are often doing this in addition to a full-time job. They need to have hours included in annual plans for this work. And then we also name the importance of safely, confidentially collecting data on SEA. And I think most of you know that this is still in development. There's a lot of discussion around this. I know CHS Alliance, the Steering Committee for Humanitarian Response are developing some work on this to better harmonize standards for data collection. And their work is also included as a resource. Okay, so this is some suggestions that we had on how you could potentially use this guide. And then we'll leave it to you to bring up some other ideas afterwards about how you think your organization can use it. It has a lot of potential uses. Obviously, notably, it can be used to help you and focal points create a country-specific survivor support guide and resource list for the different countries where you work before incidents occur. The guide also, as I said, gives you crucial tips on how you can operationalize survivor support in your organization. So it can be used as a tool to help you with, let's say you're doing a new gender equality strategy, or your annual planning or strategic planning even with your organization. I would encourage you to embed the survivor support work into the other work that you're doing, and you can use this guide as a way to do that, right? It also provides good guidance for those like who are focal points or others on how to develop your plans to support survivors. And then I saw that there are quite a few folks who already have survivor support resources on the line, which is awesome. And then it's always continuous improvement, right? So we've created this guide so that you can also use it kind of as a benchmark to say, okay, where are we doing well with survivor support and what ideas can we integrate from this guide to do even better? So those are some ideas that we have on how to use it. And I'm hopeful that you'll get inspired to use it for even more things for the organization. So that's all from me for now. And now I'm going to give it back to Ramisha to give you some case study examples of how this is brought to life.
Awesome. Thank you so much for going through that. So if you want to just flip to the next slide. So the first organization that's actually gone through and developed the first kind of run at the guides is Crossroads International. They're on the call today as well. And so it just sort of is I took some screenshots of the documents that they have just to share with you what they look like. So this is what the data collection tool looked like for their volunteers in country to figure out what information goes into which section. So the steps to take, the medical services, contact information for other local NGOs that can provide support, as well as what kinds of support, how do you get in touch with them, where in the country are they located. That's all really important information to have. And then the legal context for the country includes things like the age of consent, what is the legal definition of gender-based violence, of assault, all of those kinds of things. So this is what a tool could look like for your organization when you're collecting the data from the field. And if we flip to the next slide, this is what I envisioned when these first sort of came to be. What the end result would look like would be sort of one of those trifold brochures, so that it's easy enough to hide just in a stack of papers. It doesn't need to draw a lot of attention to itself. But so this would be the first page of this. And so the key facts, just to outline sort of, only national hospitals in Tanzania are allowed to administer rape kits, what the age of consent is, that kind of stuff. Then it's got the women's rights NGOs, what medications are available and how easy are they to access, where can you get rape kits, and then the appropriate legal context for survivors to know before they approach systems of support. And on the next slide, we've got sort of what the inside would look like. And this is very text heavy because this very clearly lays out and outlines what every step is for any of the options that a survivor would take after something happens to them. So one, like for Tanzania, for example, it would be that you report to a police station first, and then you go to a hospital. And then if you just choose to skip the police services, what happens if you just go to the hospital? All of that's very clearly laid out so that in the event of an emergency, that the survivor can make the decision that is best suited for them. And a personal goal of mine is that when lots of NGOs have these guides ready to go, we can bring them over to consular services and ask them what the actual support they're willing to provide for Canadians in country is, because there's no clear example or outline of what they should be doing or could be doing, and their training needs to be updated, all of those kinds of things that happen. And there's a comment in the chat that I just am looking at right now. These are both really great arguments to be made as to why you would prefer victim or survivor. I personally was seeing a lot of stigma and backlash when I came forward with my story, and I did not like being called a victim. So anything that I have my fingers in usually just has the word survivor, but it's up to your organization what they feel the most comfortable with when you present this information. So those are our examples, and I guess we can turn it over for Q&A. And again, we'll stop recording so that no one's, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry,
no, I just wanted to add, because I think there's some really great points about, terminology. I'll just quickly add that I think it's also possible, like Ramisha said, I think all of us, like many of us who are survivors, we need to identify for ourselves. So that's a way that you can think about, like, so just making, when you're presenting this guide, you can also just be like, the person gets to define it. We just happen to use this term for the purposes of this guide, but creating some space so that the person can identify for themselves, and it may shift over time how they want to identify themselves.
thank you. Thank you to both of you for introducing the guide and presenting the salient points of it. I would like to share my screen now because I would like to ask you, how else do you think we could use this guide to support your organization and PSEA efforts? So there is a response. Sera utile d'inclure dans notre module de formation sur la prévention d'abus et de l'exploitation et du harcèlement sexuel. Sorry, my French is a bit rusty. So it would be useful to use it on trainings. What else? How else do you think you could use this tool? With partners, excellent. Support development of a country context analysis, yes, definitely. Disseminated at the grassroots, yes. PSEA networks as a template for our franchise organizations, yes. With donors to advocate for funding for survivor support, excellent. To write proposals to mainstream survivor supporting programs, that is key. As part of the material given to participants of activities, yes. In refugee camps, yes. How else? These are excellent ideas that the audience could use for building complaints mechanisms. Yes, to create communication and information campaigns. Pour la formation. For training. I'll give you 30 more seconds in case you are writing your ideas right now. As an annex of the organization code of conduct. Yes, but as Adriana said, it should be a guide that you use all the time and not it doesn't get on the last drawer, to ensure that we are all singing from the same book, sorry. Included in the employee manual, yes. Yes, these are excellent ideas. Thank you so much for participating. Now we've been talking a lot and it is the time for you to talk if you want. You can, if you have questions, you can raise your hand or you can ask them on Mentimeter if you don't want to talk. I will stop sharing right now so that we can